Saudi Arabia represents a very unique type of culture that embodies modernization embedded in tradition. And the Bedouin jewelry metaphor helps us understand a little bit about the fundamentals of the culture itself, but by taking a particular angle at a subsect or a subculture, the Bedouins themselves, it tries to take us back to the basic understandings of the region, if you will, and then apply those to the context of international business. It's a really interesting metaphor, and I think it intrigues us more than others that we've read because it's not one that comes to mind when we think of Saudi Arabia. Some of the images you see here are the stereotypical thoughts of the area, and particular Saudi Arabia, but the Bedouin jewelry is a little different. Before we get into the metaphor itself, as we always examine the political economy itself of the country in which we examine, we need to think about the infancy of this type of country and where it's become and how quickly it's moved from its simple, humble origins to a global player in terms of production of its main export, which is oil, and also in terms of, again, its geopolitical power that it compromises that it is considered strong in the area, in the region itself of the MENA and the Gulf region, but also in terms of its world role as well in terms of trade, economics, and politics. It is originally, the country itself is originally historically developed from a tribal history in 1932, and it has constantly been ruled by form of monarchy. It is the official guardian of Mecca and Medina, and so the religious affiliations that we have with the country are at considerably accurate because of what the official stance is on its presence in the Middle East, and for Islamic countries particularly. It's a large population country compared to other small nations in the region, the Gulf players that produce oil and also other different productions in the area, and it has a relatively large GDP per capita, but also it has a very large Gini coefficient as well. There has constantly been a struggle between tradition, conservatism, and modernity, and as you can see now with the monarchy and its movements towards a Dubai-like kind of impression or image about the country that stems from the need for the countries to diversify beyond oil, which represents 90% of its exports earnings and about 87 to 89% of the entire government's revenues. Knowing that that's not a sustainable model for the continuum of the country, they have tried to diversify, and some part of that diversification has extended to the development of an entire section of the country or region of the country, the West beautiful locations as an attractive tourism sector under NEOM Vision 2030. So the metaphor itself is about Bedouin jewelry, and there are 4 pillars that carry the metaphor. The bold form of this type of silver-based jewelry, which again is not what comes to mind immediately when we say jewelry in the Middle East. It's not the gold, it's traditional, handcrafted is the second type of metaphor pillar that lends itself to explain some of the cultural values. The traditional design, because most of these will follow some traditional design, even though they might look slightly different. And what's mostly interesting and intriguing about this pillar is the fact that it's female ownership. And again, because it looks at the Bedouins particularly as a representation of a subculture of the entire Saudi culture, the bold form is explained in terms of its lavish generosity. And even though the bold form that is sometimes viewed as even maybe vulgar by some, that is actually translated into some cultural value or attitude about generosity and even, if you will, the sophistication of the language itself. Many have recognized in the Middle East and particularly in Saudi Arabia, much like other countries we've studied as well, the favors, rules, and treatments that lead to corruption sometimes because of the relationship-based type of cultures that we study. However, because Hofstede never really studied the Middle East to start with in the 80s and 90s and only conducted recent sort of follow-up studies in the region, Hofstede did identify that the power distance that measures up to 95, coupled with uncertainty avoidance in 80s, does lead to that type of formalization, in fact, bureaucratic type of structures that allow for differential in understanding power diversity, and at the same time usually applying that maybe with a favorism in part. And this is also something that you kind of grasp at when you're reading the bold form of the actual the jewelry that's being described. As an implication for international business, this is a high context type of culture, truly built on relationships, and this has allowed for the divergence between the West and this Middle Eastern culture, so that they could find a way by which they could conduct business successfully together, and even conduct relationships both on the short term and the long run, if there's an understanding on the Western partner's part that that is simply the way by which business is conducted. So that's particularly related to communication. Also, decision making takes long, just as much as the handcrafted type of detail that goes into the creation of these beautiful pieces of jewelry. For implications of long-term orientation, you'll notice also that it's important to make sure that there is a respect about honor and shame. We've learned a little bit about that in Japan as well. And very, very important to establish is the role of religion itself. This is one of the countries where tradition is embedded not just in values set forth by norms, but these norms are actually usually institutionalized through religion. So the time is definitely a relaxed type of polychronic approach to decision making and also communication. But when it also comes to negotiation, also this is a very important attribute that we've learned from the handcrafted appearance. The intricacy and detail that goes into these types of outcomes is something that has also led many in the Western cultures to recognize the difficulty of negotiating and standing still for the most part at the non-task sounding, and sometimes basically trying to get only to information exchange before getting to persuasion and concessions. Another pillar is the female ownership, which is really interesting because identifying identifying the metaphor through a pillar that's particular to women is one that makes us think. The traditional life of women, Saudi women, will slowly lose its luster, is the quote that you see in the writing by Gannon and Pillay. And because this has been a view, sort of an exterior view of the Westerners into the culture, Saudis themselves have recognized that there's a need to portray what Saudi's vision is as it moves forward to modernization. But it's got to be a cautious type of approach to doing business as well, because just as slowly as these type of norms will change, that type of change in the business culture will also probably take its time. It's not going to be expected that the team formations and female responsibilities in management will suddenly become recognized overnight, or the fact that when we mention the difficulties of role establishments and gender biases, that's not also going to be eradicated over time. However, the beauty of identifying this pillar and still representing it in something that was traditionally embedded in Bedouin culture gives promise and potential of these type of movements towards a business environment that's all-inclusive, that may eventually become a little easier for international management.